May 8, 1972, Sabina Flight 571 stands still on the tarmac at Lad Airport in Israel. The aircraft is not moved for hours. Inside, 100 passengers are trapped, entering their second full day as hostages. The cabin air is heavy. People are exhausted, scared, and unsure if they will leave the plane alive. Moving through the aisles are 4 hijackers. They carry pistols and grenades and make sure everyone sees them. Their nerves are stretched thin. Their demands shift and harden as time passes, driven by pressure and fear of losing control. Outside the aircraft, the scene is just as tense. Military vehicles form a tight perimeter around the plane. Searchlights cut through the night and sweep across the fuselage. Israeli negotiators keep talking, delaying, asking for clarification, buying minutes wherever they can. Every conversation is meant to slow the situation down. While those talks continue, a plan is quietly being finalized, one that will change how hostage rescues are carried out across the world. What the hijackers do not know is that 16 of Israel's most elite commandos are already moving into position. They are not dressed like soldiers. They wear white coveralls and carry metal toolboxes in their hands. From a distance, they look like ordinary airport technicians. Their cover story is simple and convincing. They claim there is a technical issue with the aircraft that needs immediate inspection. It is a lie designed to get them close enough to act. Once they reach the plane and board it, everything will happen fast. There will be no room for hesitation. Each man has a specific role. Each movement has been rehearsed again and again. Within minutes, the commandos will strike. The attack will be so fast and controlled that nearly every hostage will survive. All 4 hijackers will be killed before they can react or detonate the explosives they are carrying. This operation will become known as Operation Isotope. It is remembered as the moment when deception became a weapon. White coveralls turned into combat gear, toolboxes hid rifles. The boundary between maintenance workers and special forces vanished completely. The mission is a mix of careful planning and sudden violence, where a single mistake would mean disaster. It is also the moment Israel sends a clear message that hijacked aircraft are no longer safe places for terrorists to hide. The operation will draw attention around the world, not only because it succeeds, but because of who takes part in it. Among the 16 commandos wearing white coveralls is a young officer named Benjamin Netanyahu. Years later, he will become Israel's prime minister. His unit commander, Ehud Barak, will also rise to that same office decades later. On that afternoon in May, none of that matters. They are not politicians or public figures.
They are soldiers focused on one task, carrying out a mission where every second counts, and where failure would mean the death of everyone on board. Understanding how mechanics later turned into assault forces starts with understanding why Flight 571 ended up in Israel at all, and why Palestinian militants believed that seizing a civilian airliner could help their fight against a country that had spent its entire existence struggling to survive. The idea did not come out of nowhere. By the early 1970s, hijackings had become a tool meant to draw attention, force negotiations, and project strength far beyond the borders of the Middle East. The operation itself began 48 hours earlier, on May 8, 1972, when Sabina Flight 571 departed Brussels on its scheduled route to Tel Aviv. The aircraft was a Boeing 707, carrying 90 passengers and 10 crew members. Nothing about the flight stood out. It was a normal commercial departure, processed under routine procedures, and it did not trigger any special concern from Belgian security authorities. People checked in, boarded, and took their seats as they had done countless times before. Among them were 4 passengers who had bought legitimate tickets several days earlier, 2 men and 2 women. Their documents were in order. They carried no weapons that metal detectors of the time could identify, and no explosives that existing screening methods could uncover. In appearance, behavior, and paperwork, they blended in as ordinary travelers heading to Israel. There was no outward sign that anything was wrong. But they were not ordinary passengers. All 4 were members of Black September, a Palestinian militant organization that had already made a name for itself through bold and increasingly public attacks against Israeli and Western targets. They had been selected carefully and trained for weeks. Each person had a defined role. They rehearsed repeatedly until timing, movement, and coordination felt automatic rather than forced. They memorized the layout of the aircraft, learned standard crew procedures, and studied earlier hijackings to understand what had worked and what had failed. About 30 minutes after takeoff, once the aircraft reached cruising altitude over Austria, the plan moved from preparation to action. The 4 operatives rose at the same moment. The 2 men, Ali Taha and Theris Halsa, headed forward toward the cockpit. The women, Rima Tanis and another operative whose identity was never conclusively confirmed, remained in the passenger cabin, positioning themselves to control the space and the people inside it. At that point, they revealed weapons that no one on board had seen during boarding. Firearms and grenades appeared, assembled from parts that had been brought onto the plane separately.
The gaps in aviation security at 1972 made this possible, and the group had planned carefully around those weaknesses. What followed was fast and disciplined. There was no shouting or chaos at first, just decisive movement. The takeover unfolded with professional precision. In less than 90 seconds, the four militants had established control of the aircraft, the crew, and the passengers. A routine flight had been transformed into a hijacking, and Flight 571 was no longer just another plane on its way to Tel Aviv. One hijacker forced his way into the cockpit and jammed a pistol against the head of Captain Reginald Levy. He told him to hold the current course and wait for further orders. His tone left no room for debate. At the same time, the other three moved through the passenger cabin with speed and coordination. They shouted commands, ordering everyone to stay seated and remain silent. They made it clear that any resistance, even a small one, would lead to the destruction of the aircraft. To remove any doubt, they openly displayed grenades. Each movement was deliberate. The message was simple and brutal. If anyone tried to rush them or interfere, the explosives would be detonated, killing everyone on board. The passengers understood this immediately. The cabin held Israeli citizens, European tourists, and business travelers heading to meetings and conferences. Fear spread fast, but so did compliance. A few passengers had military backgrounds. Some had served in security units or had combat training. For brief moments, they assessed the situation and considered possible action. But the narrow aisles, the close quarters, and the visible explosives made the reality obvious. Any attempt to fight back would end in mass death. One by one, they abandoned the thought. They sat still, hands where they could be seen, eyes forward. No sudden movements, no whispers. The hijackers began setting clear rules to keep control, routines designed to hold the aircraft under their command for the next 48 hours. Captain Levy remained calm throughout. He was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours in the air and long experience dealing with emergencies. He understood that panic would help no one. He followed every instruction exactly as given, knowing that cooperation was buying time and protecting lives. When told to change course, he did so without protest, adjusting the flight path smoothly and professionally. Later, he was ordered to contact Belgian air traffic control. The hijackers dictated their demands word for word. Captain Levy repeated them over the radio in a steady, controlled voice, even as the pistol remained pressed against his head. There was no tremor, no hesitation. His composure was part of his strategy. Through those radio transmissions, the hijackers announced what they wanted. They demanded the release of 317 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel.
They named specific individuals, people imprisoned on charges that ranged from terrorism to weapons smuggling. A strict deadline was given. If Israel failed to comply within 48 hours, the hijackers said they would begin executing hostages. In the final stage, they warned, the aircraft itself would be destroyed. They ordered Captain Levy to divert the aircraft to Lad Airport, Israel's main international gateway. The logic was simple. Touching down on Israeli territory would force the government to react fast and in public. It would also guarantee attention from the media and foreign governments. Choosing Lad instead of a neutral country showed a mix of calculation and poor judgment. The hijackers understood pressure, but they misunderstood control. By landing in Israel, they turned the crisis into something immediate and impossible to ignore. At the same time, they handed Israeli authorities full access to the aircraft, the runway, and everything around it. That choice limited their options more than it expanded them. Once the decision was made, events moved quickly. Israeli air traffic controllers followed the hijacked plane as it approached national airspace. Every change in altitude and direction was logged. Fighter jets were scrambled and took up positions alongside the aircraft, keeping visual contact without provoking a reaction. On the ground at Lad Airport, security units switched to emergency procedures designed specifically for hijackings. These plans had been discussed and revised for years, and now they were being put into effect in real time. By the moment Flight 571 touched down at 16:47 hours on May 8th, Israeli Defense Force commanders were already gathering. They met to review intelligence, assess risks, and begin shaping possible operations. Nothing was left to chance. Every scenario was examined, from prolonged containment to a rapid assault, even as negotiators prepared to stall for time if needed. Prime Minister Golda Meir called an emergency meeting of the Security Cabinet within an hour of the hijacking becoming known. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan was present, along with Chief of Staff David Elazar and Mossad directors Viza Meir. Senior officers from the military and intelligence services joined them, each bringing expertise that could influence the final response. The atmosphere was tense and direct. There was no room for theory or speeches. Israel's policy on hostage situations was clear and long established. There would be no negotiations, no concessions, and no release of prisoners to satisfy terrorist demands. Saying it was easy. Enforcing it was harder when 100 lives were at risk and the world was watching. Every person in the room understood the weight of that responsibility. Golda Meir made the core decision without delay. Israel would not release prisoners. That position would not change, no matter how the situation developed.
From that moment on, all planning focused on resolving the crisis on Israel's terms. Once such a precedent was set, it would open the door to endless hijackings and kidnappings. Terrorist groups would quickly learn that Israel could be pressured into trading prisoners for hostages. That understanding alone would make future attacks more likely. The choice facing the government was brutal. It was morally painful and politically risky. Any prime minister who agreed to resist demands had to accept that some hostages might die rather than give in to blackmail. Meir understood this, and so did her security advisors. They believed that surrendering once would not save lives in the long run. It would cost more lives later by rewarding violence and encouraging copycat operations. After deciding what Israel would not do, the leadership turned to what Israel would do instead. The objective was clear and narrow. The aircraft would be stormed. The hijackers would be eliminated. The hostages would be brought out alive, if at all possible. This was not left to theory or public debate. The government authorized military planners to prepare a direct action operation with no margin for error. The task was assigned to Saret Metkal, the elite special forces unit trusted with Israel's most sensitive missions. The unit specialized in deep penetration behind enemy lines, hostage rescue, and covert actions that demanded exact timing, restraint, and discipline under crushing pressure. These were operations where hesitation could be fatal, and mistakes could not be corrected once the action began. Saret Metkal's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ehud Barak, was given full authority to design and carry out the rescue. At 30 years old, Barak already had a formidable reputation inside Israeli military circles. He had led daring operations deep inside enemy territory during the War of Attrition, and had proven himself calm and decisive under fire. His strength was not just experience, but judgment. He knew how to balance aggression with control and how to keep a team focused when seconds mattered. This mission required flawless execution. Success meant saving lives, failure meant mass casualties. Barak selected his assault force from Saret Metkal's most seasoned operators. 16 commandos were chosen based on hard criteria, not rank or seniority. They were experts in close-quarters combat, accurate shooters under extreme stress, and capable of making instant decisions in confined, chaotic spaces where hostages and hijackers would be mixed together. Every man had to know exactly what to do without being told once the operation began. Among those selected was Captain Benjamin Netanyahu, then 23 years old. He was serving his second term with the unit after completing officer training. His assignment was central to the plan.
Netanyahu would lead the element responsible for entering the passenger cabin and neutralizing the hijackers there, while Barak's group moved to secure the cockpit. The plan depended on precise coordination between these teams. Any delay or confusion could give the hijackers time to react. There would be no second attempt. The tactical problem was severe and unforgiving. The question was how to get onto a hijacked aircraft without provoking instant executions. The hijackers were watching the doors closely. Any obvious attack would be seen at once, and explosives would be set off before commandos could act. Standard assault methods were useless here. Breaking doors, throwing flashbangs, and charging inside at full speed would only guarantee that hostages died before the team reached the terrorists. Speed alone could not solve this. The team needed a way to place operators inside the aircraft, close to the hijackers, before anyone understood that an operation had begun. The answer did not come from brute force, but from deception mixed with nerve. The idea was to make the hijackers believe that the people boarding the aircraft were harmless maintenance workers. These supposed technicians would be responding to a made-up technical issue. The plan required building a situation where the hijackers themselves would allow entry, convinced that mechanics were needed to inspect a problem. Once inside, the operators could move through the cabin in plain sight, positioning themselves near the terrorists. Only then would they reveal who they really were. It was simple on paper and terrifying in reality. The risk was absolute. If the ruse collapsed at any stage, even for a moment, the hijackers would know they were facing an assault. There would be no second chance. Detonations would follow immediately. Because of this, the planning went far beyond tactics. Mossad psychologists were brought into the process to study the mental state of the hijackers and forecast their reactions. Every likely response was examined in detail. Their conclusion was clear. After 24 hours under extreme pressure with no resolution, the hijackers would be exhausted and on edge. Anxiety would be growing. Control would feel fragile.
In that condition, concern about the aircraft itself would rise. If they were told there was a technical issue that could worsen if ignored, they would be inclined to allow maintenance access. Being trapped on a disabled aircraft was not a risk they would want to take. The invented problem had to be chosen with care. It needed to feel serious enough to demand immediate attention, but not so dramatic that it sounded like a trick. It could not suggest an imminent crash or fire. It had to sound routine, boring, and believable, something that required inspection, not panic. Every detail was shaped to match real procedures, real language, and real timing. The scenario was built piece by piece, with plausibility as the highest priority.
Only if it felt completely ordinary would the deception hold long enough to work. Israeli officials planned to approach the hijackers with a technical explanation that sounded routine and urgent. They would say the aircraft's air conditioning and pressurization systems had developed a serious fault and needed to be checked right away. If the problem was ignored, the systems would shut down completely. The cabin would heat up fast, the air would become difficult to breathe, and the interior would soon be impossible to occupy. To prevent that outcome, ground mechanics would have to come aboard to inspect the systems and carry out repairs. The hijackers would be allowed to observe the entire process. They could stand nearby and watch the work, making sure the people boarding the plane carried only standard tools and equipment. Nothing could look like a weapon or anything that suggested a threat. To sell the story, Israeli authorities borrowed white coveralls and toolboxes from real Sabena maintenance crews. The commandos wore the same uniforms used by actual mechanics, carried genuine tools, and moved exactly the way maintenance staff would during a real inspection. Preparation went far beyond clothing and props. The team rehearsed their roles repeatedly, using mock-ups of the aircraft. They practiced how mechanics walk down the aisle, how they speak to pilots and crew, how they lean into panels, check gauges, and trace wiring. They learned to discuss technical problems using the right terms and the right tone, as if they were dealing with a routine malfunction. Every small detail mattered. The hijackers were alert and suspicious, and any mistake, hesitation, or wrong behavior could expose the deception and end the operation instantly. Weapons were the most difficult issue to solve. The commandos needed guns that could stop the hijackers immediately, but would not punch through the aircraft's pressurized hull and cause a disaster. They also had to avoid bullets passing through a target and hitting hostages seated nearby. The answer was .22 caliber pistols fitted with specialized ammunition designed for close-range hostage rescue. The low-caliber rounds were unlikely to penetrate the fuselage, and precise shots to the head could neutralize a hijacker with a single hit, reducing the risk of stray fire. Each commando hid a pistol inside a toolbox, buried under wrenches, screwdrivers, and testing devices. From the outside, the boxes looked ordinary and heavy with equipment. The team trained to draw and fire in one smooth movement, shifting from the appearance of checking tools to engaging a target in less than 1 second. Speed, surprise, and absolute accuracy were essential. There would be no second chances once the first shot was fired. The rehearsals were draining and repetitive. Teams ran the same exercise again and again, changing small details each time. Hijacker positions shifted, hostage reactions varied.
The timing of the assault signal was adjusted by seconds. Every version was tested. The goal was simple but unforgiving. Each operator had to act on instinct once the shooting began. There would be no chance to talk, no time to correct mistakes. When the deception collapsed and the assault started, everything had to flow without pause. Timing mattered more than anything. The commandos had to board the aircraft, move through the interior, and quietly place themselves close to all 4 hijackers before the first shot was fired. If gunfire started too early, the balance would be lost. Any hijacker not immediately engaged would have a window to react. That reaction could mean detonating explosives or killing hostages. There was no margin for delay. The strike had to happen everywhere at once. The plan demanded simultaneous action in separate sections of the plane: the cockpit, the forward cabin, the rear cabin. Each hijacker had to be neutralized in the same instant. No warning, no staggered response. One unified moment of violence designed to leave no room for resistance. Anything less would fail. The signal itself was intentionally simple. When Barak spoke the word over the concealed radio, every operator would act. Weapons would be drawn. Each man would engage his assigned target at the exact same time. From that second onward, nothing could be adjusted. The outcome would rest entirely on speed, accuracy, and the ability to fire without hesitation. A pause of even a fraction of a second could cost lives. A missed shot could unravel the entire operation. Perfection was not a goal. It was a requirement. Failure meant catastrophe. While the assault force prepared, Israeli negotiators stayed in contact with the hijackers. The talks were a performance. They spoke of prisoner lists and conditions, pretending progress was possible. In reality, they were buying time. Every conversation was slowed on purpose. Requests for clarification piled up, procedures were questioned, bureaucratic language stretched minutes into hours and hours into days. The hijackers grew restless. Their messages became sharper, threats were repeated more often. They warned that executions would begin if delays continued. Still, no hostages were killed. That restraint revealed uncertainty. They had not fully decided their next move. Psychological pressure was part of the plan from the start. The negotiators listened carefully, adjusting their tone and responses to keep the hijackers engaged but off balance. Every delay, every vague answer, was meant to shape their thinking and hold them in place just a little longer. Israeli officials made sure the hijackers received regular meals, drinking water, and steady updates. This created a predictable rhythm. Over time, that rhythm made the situation feel normal and lowered short-term tension inside the aircraft. Nothing felt rushed, nothing felt urgent. The hijackers settled into the routine and began to believe the standoff was stable.
They were also allowed to see signs that the outside world was watching. Journalists were permitted to photograph the aircraft from a distance. Cameras stayed far enough away to avoid provoking panic, but close enough to be noticed. For the hijackers, this mattered. It reinforced the idea that their operation had global attention and that pressure on the Israeli government was growing. From their point of view, time was working in their favor. Israeli negotiators quietly shaped that belief. Every interaction was designed to make the hijackers feel in control. Requests were framed as cooperation, not demands. Responses were calm and measured. No threats were made. No deadlines were imposed. The message was subtle but constant. Nothing would happen without their approval. What the hijackers did not know was that each passing hour moved events closer to a planned assault. Delay was not buying them safety. It was buying preparation time for the commandos waiting nearby, ready to board the aircraft in white coveralls when the signal came. On the evening of May 9th, after 30 hours of standoff, Israeli officials introduced a new development. They informed the hijackers that a mechanical issue had been detected. According to the report, the aircraft's environmental control systems were showing irregular readings. These anomalies could not be ignored. If left unchecked, they could endanger everyone on board. The solution was presented as straightforward. Mechanics needed to board the plane to inspect the systems and identify the problem. The hijackers would be allowed to supervise every step. The mechanics would not touch anything unrelated to the inspection. Any repairs would be explained in advance. The tone was deliberately routine, almost boring. This was described as standard aircraft maintenance, nothing more, and something done for the safety of all involved. Inside the cabin, the hijackers argued among themselves. They spoke in Arabic over the intercom, weighing the risks. Mossad translators, listening through surveillance equipment, followed every word. They heard doubts, suspicion, and counter-arguments. Some hijackers questioned whether the problem was real. Others worried that refusing might make them appear unreasonable or reckless. The discussion dragged on for nearly an hour. In the end, they agreed to allow the maintenance crew on board, but only under strict rules. Every mechanic would be searched before boarding. They would work under constant watch. Any movement that seemed out of place would be met with immediate violence. The hijackers believed these conditions gave them full control of the situation. They were cautious, but not cautious enough. It never fully occurred to them that mechanics could be commandos in disguise. At 2200 hours, the assault team gathered in a hangar next to where Flight 571 sat under bright floodlights. The aircraft was isolated and still.
The team put on borrowed white coveralls, the kind worn by ground crews. Weapons were concealed and checked one last time. Final instructions were reviewed. There was no dramatic speech, just quiet focus. Everyone knew exactly what was about to happen. Every operator understood exactly where they fit. Each man knew his assignment, his target, and the section of the aircraft he was responsible for. There was no confusion about what to do if the cover failed, if a hijacker sensed something off, if a hostage lost control and exposed who they really were. Responses to those moments had been drilled again and again. Nothing was left vague. Still, everyone accepted a basic truth. The second they stepped onto the aircraft, reality would shift. No plan survives contact unchanged, and once inside, the number of unknowns would grow fast. Ehud Barak spoke to them one last time. He kept it short. No speeches, no attempt to raise morale. His tone was calm and workmanlike. He reminded them that 100 lives rested on precise execution. There would be no second attempt. One mistake, one pause, would end people's lives, possibly their own. He said he trusted every man standing there, not as encouragement, but as a statement of fact. They were the best operators Israel had available. When contact came, they were to shoot without hesitation. The hijackers would not hesitate, and mercy would not be returned. The plan was clear. Benjamin Netanyahu's element would be first through the door. They would move directly into the passenger cabin and take positions near the two female hijackers. Speed mattered there, but so did control. Barak's element would enter immediately after. Their route led straight toward the cockpit, where the male hijackers held Captain Levy and the rest of the flight crew. Other commandos had their own tasks. They would secure the exits front and rear, locking down escape routes and preparing the aircraft for rapid evacuation the moment the assault ended. At 22:45 hours, the approach began. The first commandos moved toward the aircraft carrying toolboxes and equipment cases. From a distance, they looked like routine ground crew. Their pace was steady, their posture relaxed. Nothing in their movements suggested urgency or threat. This was deliberate. Any sign of tension could raise suspicion. Inside the cabin, hijackers watched through the windows, tracking every step, every pause. The commandos stayed in character. They spoke to one another in clipped technical language. They discussed pressurization, airflow, environmental controls. They pointed at panels and components, mimicking routine inspection work. The words were ordinary, rehearsed, boring by design. It was exactly what the hijackers expected to see and hear. The forward door finally opened. A hijacker appeared in the doorway. A pistol was visible in his hand. He leaned forward slightly, studying each man as he stepped inside. Faces, hands, equipment.
Looking for anything that did not fit. One by one, the mechanics crossed the threshold, calm and controlled, carrying the weight of what was about to happen without letting it show. The commandos agreed to submit to pat-down searches. They stood calmly while the hijacker checked them for weapons. Their firearms stayed hidden inside sealed toolboxes, containers that looked ordinary and went unopened. The searches were careful and methodical. They were enough to ease the hijackers' doubts, but not detailed enough to uncover what was concealed inside the boxes. Nothing obvious was found, and that was all the hijacker needed to see. Netanyahu's team then moved into the passenger cabin. They walked slowly down the aisle, stopping now and then to inspect overhead panels, wiring access points, and air vents. Clipboards rested in their hands, and diagnostic tools hung from their belts. Every movement supported their cover as mechanics responding to a technical issue. At the same time, they placed themselves with intent, positioning their bodies close to the two female hijackers. The women watched them closely, eyes sharp and alert, but there was no open alarm, no command to stop. The commandos worked at a measured pace. Nothing was rushed. Each pause, each inspection was deliberate. This bought time. It allowed Barak's team to board quietly and make their way forward, step by step, toward the cockpit. The plan depended on timing. No one moved faster than necessary. No one drew attention. Inside the cabin, the hostages followed every motion. Fear sat heavy, but so did hope. Some of them realized these were not normal maintenance workers. Small details gave it away. The way the men moved together without speaking, how they never blocked one another's line of sight, how they stood where they could react instantly if needed. There was focus behind their relaxed posture, discipline beneath the casual act. The hostages noticed all of it. Still, they said nothing. Instinct told them that a single word or gesture could trigger violence before the rescuers were ready. Barak's element reached the cockpit. Inside, Ali Taha held the flight crew under control, gripping a pistol while a grenade remained close at hand. The commandos explained they needed access to cockpit systems to complete their checks. Taha listened, studying their faces. He hesitated. Suspicion was clear in his expression. But after a tense pause, he allowed them in, insisting on watching every move. The commandos stepped into the tight cockpit space. Their toolboxes were only inches from Taha. Their hands were steady, even as adrenaline surged through them. No one spoke more than necessary. Every position had been rehearsed. Every angle was covered. Now all four hijackers were within arm's reach of men who appeared focused on panels and instruments, but were actually waiting for the signal, waiting for the moment to draw their weapons and end it.
The moment arrived when deception stopped working and violence took over. There was no space left for pretending, no margin for delay. The men who had blended in as mechanics were about to become an assault force, and the difference between success and disaster would be decided in fractions of seconds. Barak's voice came through the hidden radios, calm and flat. One word followed: execute. 16 commandos moved at the same time. The change was instant and complete. The white coveralls no longer mattered. Toolboxes were abandoned as pistols appeared in practiced hands. Each operator already knew his target. There was no hesitation and no confusion. Every movement had been rehearsed until it became instinct. The passenger cabin exploded into tightly controlled violence. Netanyahu's team went straight for the female hijackers. From distances of less than 2 meters, they fired multiple shots to the head. The shots were fast and precise. The hijackers were dead before their bodies understood what was happening. They never raised their weapons. Fingers never reached triggers. Grenades were never released. Guns slipped from hands that went limp almost immediately. At the same time, inside the cockpit, Barak's element acted. Alaha was shot before he could lift his pistol or arm the grenade he carried. The .22 caliber rounds were fired at point-blank range. They penetrated his skull and killed him instantly. His body dropped where he stood. The grenade stayed clenched in his hand, never activated. The other male hijacker was positioned near the cockpit door. He turned toward the sound of gunfire, still trying to understand what was unfolding. Commandos inside the cabin engaged him at once. Multiple rounds struck him before he could react. He died on his feet. His threat ended before he could grasp that the men he thought were mechanics were soldiers and that his operation had collapsed beyond recovery. From the first shot to the moment the last hijacker was neutralized, the entire assault lasted 16 seconds. No hostage was hit by gunfire, not a single grenade detonated. The control was total. The timing was exact. Nothing went wrong. As the firing stopped, the commandos shifted roles without pause. Some began moving hostages toward emergency exits, guiding them out quickly and calmly. Others secured the aircraft, moving through the cabin and cockpit to confirm that every hijacker was dead and not merely wounded and still dangerous. Captain Levy remained at the controls. The cockpit was thick with gun smoke, and the body of Ali Taha lay crumpled beside him. Despite the chaos that had just passed, he kept his composure. He stayed focused, doing his job as the situation finally came under control. He initiated the shutdown sequence as commandos swept through the cockpit. They moved fast and methodical, checking every panel, seat, and access point to make sure no explosives had been planted.
They looked for timers, pressure triggers, and dead man switches. Nothing was assumed safe until it was confirmed by hand and by sight. The flight crew did exactly what they had been trained to do. They had drilled for emergencies many times, but never for anything this extreme. Still, muscle memory took over. They followed evacuation steps they knew well, even if they had never imagined using them after an armed assault. In the passenger cabin, the hostages were led out row by row. Emergency slides were deployed, and people were guided down as commandos secured the area. The pace was urgent but controlled. No shouting, no rushing that could cause a fall or spark panic. Some people cried openly as their feet hit the ground. Others said nothing at all, staring ahead as if disconnected from what had just happened. A few were shaking hard, adrenaline still flooding their bodies. Medics were already in position on the tarmac. They moved in as soon as the first evacuees reached the ground. Most injuries were minor. Bruises from rough landings, sprained ankles, scrapes from hurried movement. Nothing life-threatening. Everyone there understood how much worse it could have been if the assault had gone wrong. Netanyahu and his team stayed on the aircraft after the evacuation was complete. They did not treat success as the end of the mission. They began a full secondary sweep, slow and exhaustive. Every section of the plane was checked again. The cargo hold was cleared item by item. Lavatories were opened and searched. Overhead bins were inspected by hand. The team knew the risk of relaxing too early. Past operations had shown that missed threats can surface after the main danger seemed over. That kind of mistake had cost lives before. This time, nothing was left to chance. Outside the perimeter, media coverage began almost immediately. Reporters who had been tracking the standoff saw the evacuation unfold and relayed updates in real time. Cameras captured the final moments as passengers were moved to safety. By morning, news outlets around the world were reporting the outcome. Headlines praised Israel for a successful hostage rescue. Analysts pointed to the planning, the deception, and the precision that allowed operators to get close before revealing their intent. Nearly all hostages had survived. Every hijacker had been neutralized. The operation also reinforced a hard lesson. Hijacked aircraft were not invulnerable if attackers could be misled and isolated. At the same time, the risks were clear. One hostage, Miriam Anderson, had been shot during the initial takeover. She did not survive her injuries despite the rescue itself succeeding. Her death stood as a reminder that even a near-flawless operation still carried a human cost. Her death underscored a harsh truth that professionals already knew but rarely stated so plainly.
Even flawless planning and disciplined execution cannot remove every danger when confronting armed terrorists who are prepared to kill without hesitation. Operation Isotope became proof that some risks remain, no matter how skilled the operators are or how carefully an assault is designed. From that moment on, the operation was studied not as a clean victory, but as a complex case with real costs and lasting consequences. The tactical conclusions drawn from Operation Isotope reshaped hostage rescue thinking across the world. Special Forces units analyzed the mission in detail and came to a shared understanding. Classic rapid assault methods were not enough in aircraft hijacking situations. In confined spaces where terrorists could kill hostages instantly or trigger explosives, raw speed alone did not guarantee success. A fast breach could just as easily provoke immediate executions as it could save lives. The Israeli method offered a different answer. It showed that deception could replace speed, and that entering from within, through misdirection and disguise, could be safer than a violent breach from the outside. By using subterfuge, operators gained proximity and control before the terrorists fully grasped the situation. This shift in thinking marked a turning point in counterterrorism operations. European counterterrorism units soon began adapting similar ideas. Training scenarios were built around approaching hijacked aircraft under false identities, such as catering workers, maintenance personnel, or official negotiators. The aim was to normalize the presence of operators close to the target until the moment action was unavoidable. This principle spread quickly, from planners and engineers to soldiers on the ground, becoming a standard model for missions where overwhelming speed was unrealistic, but surprise could still be engineered. The effect on Palestinian militant organizations was profound. Aircraft hijackings had long been favored because they attracted global attention, produced valuable hostages for bargaining, and appeared insulated from direct military response once the plane was on the ground. Operation Isotope shattered that assumption. It sent a clear message that Israel would accept extreme risk rather than negotiate, and that a hijacked aircraft was not a safe haven. Instead, it could become a controlled trap where rescuers might already be in place before the hijackers understood the threat. For the commandos involved, the operation marked a defining point in their lives. It shaped reputations, careers, and future paths far beyond the military. Benjamin Netanyahu, in particular, would repeatedly cite his participation in Operation Isotope throughout his political life. He used it as evidence of first-hand experience with terrorism and as justification for his belief that confronting existential threats requires cold calculation, difficult choices, and a willingness to accept consequences that cannot be fully predicted.
Ehud Barak also relied on his operational background to build trust on security matters that shaped Israeli politics at the time. His personal involvement in elite missions gave weight to his public positions. Yet the operation brought consequences that went far beyond the immediate tactical win. Inside the confined space of the aircraft, surrounded by civilians, the commandos faced an intense psychological strain. Close-quarters combat left no room for distance or detachment. Firing lethal weapons just inches away from innocent passengers forced the operators to fully accept that a single mistake, a pause, or a wrong movement could have led to mass casualties. This reality stayed with many of them long after the mission ended. Several members of the unit later spoke openly about anxiety, sleep problems, and recurring intrusive memories. These reactions were not unusual. They were typical responses to operations where decisions about life and death had to be made in fractions of seconds, with no margin for error. The success of the mission did not erase the internal cost paid by those who carried it out. Instead, it added a layer of personal burden that followed them into civilian life and later service. Operation Isotope also raised a larger issue that it never fully answered. Tactical success did not automatically translate into strategic change. Israel proved it could carry out a precise military rescue under extreme conditions, but this capability did not stop future hijackings, nor did it ease the deeper conflicts that fueled such attacks. Palestinian militant groups continued their operations, studying Israeli responses and adjusting their own methods. Each improvement on one side triggered a counter-adjustment on the other, creating a constant cycle of action and reaction rather than a lasting solution. Over time, Israel refined its counter-terror tactics, drawing lessons from missions like this one. But adaptation worked both ways. The conflict evolved, and violence remained a recurring feature rather than a resolved chapter. Military innovation brought short-term advantages, not long-term stability. 4 decades later, the white coveralls and toolboxes used during Operation Isotope sit behind glass in Israeli military museums. They are displayed next to photographs, mission notes, and official reports. These items mark a moment when improvisation and bravery solved a problem that appeared unsolvable. Soldiers took on the role of maintenance workers and performed it convincingly enough to deceive armed terrorists.
16 men, dressed in work uniforms, carried out a rescue that challenged the assumption that hostage crises always required negotiation or concession. The operation stands as proof that such scenarios were not automatically lost causes. Still, it also leaves an unresolved tension. These missions can achieve remarkable tactical victories, but they exist within conflicts that do not disappear through force alone.
The success of Operation Isotope remains clear. What it could not deliver was an end to the conditions that made such missions necessary in the first place. Operation Isotope saved lives right away, but it did not stop future hijackings or deal with the deeper grievances that fueled Palestinian militancy. It showed in very concrete terms what well-trained special forces were capable of doing under extreme pressure. At the same time, it exposed the clear limits of tactical success when it comes to larger political and strategic problems. A flawless assault could resolve a crisis in the moment, but it could not change the conditions that made such crises likely in the first place. As the last hostages slid down the emergency chutes and reached the ground, the aircraft grew quiet. The only movement left came from the commandos, moving methodically through the cabin and cargo areas to complete their final checks. The operation itself was over. The immediate danger had passed, and the violence had ended. No more shots echoed through the metal shell of the plane. What remained was the aftermath, both physical and political. On the surface, the result looked clear. Lives were saved, the hijackers were neutralized, the aircraft was secured. Yet beneath that clarity sat a set of unresolved questions. How should states confront terrorism without escalating cycles of violence? What level of risk is acceptable when hostages are involved and time is limited? And can military force, no matter how precise, solve problems that are rooted in politics, identity, and long-standing conflict? Even as technicians and soldiers moved through the wreckage, peeling away layers of disguise and equipment, those questions lingered. One mechanic removed his white coveralls, revealing the combat uniform underneath, a small detail that captured the nature of the operation itself. Deception, speed, and force had worked in that moment. But once the noise faded and the plane stood still, it became clear that the operation's meaning extended far beyond the tarmac. The tactical victory was undeniable, but the strategic and moral debates it sparked would continue long after everything else had been packed away.